My name's Rob Felstead, and I'm a Senior Policy Manager for the Global Challenges Research Fund, based within the Research Councils, the UK Research Councils. So today, what I'm going to be talking about mainly is the Interdisciplinary Research Hubs call, which is a call which opened a while ago and is sort of coming towards the sort of intention to submit an outline phases. And it's where we're encouraging applicants, they're UK-led, we're encouraging input from partners in developing countries. But what I wanted to do first was to say a little bit more about the Global Challenges Research Fund and what we do and how we sit in the context of some of the other UK activities. So I'll do that now, and yes, please do put any questions you have into the box. Okay, so there are a number of ranges of way that the UK funds research for international development, and a lot of these are quite new actually, so they've kind of popped up over the last few years. So the one that's the most established is the Department for International Development, who over the 5 years, so we do things in 5-year spending reviews in the UK, and so that all the figures here are what they are over about 5 years. So the Department for International Development has its research budget that it uses to inform its investment decisions and other things, and that's £1.5 billion. We also have the Newton Fund, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, and that's about £700 million. We have the Global Challenges Research Fund, which I work for, and that is £1.5 billion. And we also have some health-focused funds, so these are the Ross Fund and the Fleming Fund, and these are generally focused on certain things around health. That the Fleming Fund, for example, is around antimicrobial resistance. And these are run through the Department of Health, but I won't talk about what the different government departments are. That's probably not quite so interesting, but these are the different funds that we have. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Newton Fund and the Global Challenges Research Fund. So these are both funded primarily through the research councils, although there are other people involved as well. So they essentially have the same primary and secondary objectives, which is to promote the economic development and social welfare of developing countries. But they're also looking as a secondary objective to contribute to the continued strength of the UK's research and innovation base. So in terms of the differences between them, the Newton Fund works with partner countries. So it identifies partner countries. Those partner countries then provide matched research resource for the programs, and they're developed on a agency to agency level. So the research councils, for example, will talk to the funding agency within that country to develop joint priorities that will then be funded. And the primary focus for those, I would say, would be middle income countries on the OECD Development Assistance Committee list. So that's kind of where the focus is. The Global Challenges Research Fund allows a wider regional focus, so it looks at widespread issues, and it doesn't require a country-to-country partnership at the agency level. So it's more kind of bottom-up, working with the researchers' priorities in those countries and what they come up with, working in partnership with the UK researchers. We don't require a match for funding or resource, so we can fund most or all of the resources. And all countries that are on the OECD Development Assistance Committee list are included in that. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about our strategy. So we have some broad challenge-focused areas, and you can find more details about this in our strategy, which we have online. But there are 3 main focuses to this. So there's equitable access to sustainable development, sustainable economies and societies, and human rights, good governance, and social justice. In terms of our general approach, we're looking to generate excellent and novel research, but that research has to translate into measurable development impacts. And we're looking for that impact to be a broad range of impacts at different scales, and a sustainable program with a legacy beyond our investment. So I was talking about our 5 years of investment. We would like it to go beyond that. We also do have a focus on interdisciplinary research. So looking to build research capacity, and that's a capacity to think across, between and within the sustainable development goals. And that's a particular focus for the Hubs call, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So there are a range of things across the fund that are possibly more disciplinary focus, but for what I've been working on, it's definitely around a sort of interdisciplinary focus. And we're looking to both assemble new knowledge and insights across different research communities. So that may be research communities that haven't been involved before, but we're also looking to build on the previous investments in this work as well. So we're looking to build on what we've done already, but also assemble new knowledge and insights from different research communities. I'd like to talk about global partnerships, and this is really, really important to what we do. So we have a requirement for our calls that they are co-developed with international partners. So if you are doing work with, or that may have a positive impact in a country, that the researchers in that country are developed in that are involved in developing that research, and we want these to be substantial, genuine, and meaningful. So meaningful partnerships with an equal role in that, and of course the research has to consider the actual context of that country. So what we're not talking about is researchers in the UK on their own developing ideas and proposing solutions without at least talking to the researchers inside those countries. Taking this one step further, what we encourage is that the partnerships are used to identify the research gaps and needs, to co-create research questions and research outcomes, but also to test the solutions to actual problems. And in doing this, we are looking to build research capacity in the UK, but also in developing countries to enable this research to take place. We also appreciate that in order to have impact as part of these research programs, that there needs to be partnership with non-research organisations. So, for example, NGOs and governmental agencies, to identify what the development needs are, but also to test the potential limitations of the research outcomes on real-world problems. It can also allow real-world implementation to be co-designed between researchers and people from these organisations, and then it actually has an input, for example, into policy. So now what I'll do is I'll briefly talk about our Interdisciplinary Research Hubs overview. So the call itself is for challenge-led and impact-focused research hubs. So these need to be led by UK research organisations. So for these particular investments, they will need to be led by a UK research organisation. They are large awards, so they are £8 to £20 million over 5 years. So these are very large for the research councils, and we're looking to fund 12 to 15. Now, if you look at the assessment process, what we're doing is we're asking people to tell us if they plan to submit a hub by the end of this week, but then they have further time to develop their ideas to outline stage, and then if they are successful at outline stage, and we will let people know that in the end of January, beginning of February, then they have again another 3 months to develop their full proposals for May 2018. And what we expect is that the applicant groups will continue to develop and expand their partnerships throughout that process. So just because they've identified partners now does not mean that they can't enhance their proposals by adding new partners and developing new partnerships, and that's something that we are looking to encourage. I've just seen a question there around multilateral organisations with partner organisations be a lead in the proposal. So what I'll do is I'll come to that at the end. I'll just talk a little bit about exactly how the partnerships can work in this. Okay, so one thing I wanted to talk about this call is that it's focused around intractable development challenges. So these are ones that cut across multiple sustainable development goals and are particularly resistant to change, and that can't be solved by a single organisation, sector or discipline. And so to tackle those challenges, applicant groupings, and these will be large groupings of applicants to these awards, need to be able to think between and across sustainable development goals, but understand how different disciplines can contribute to that, as well as having an awareness of the underlying factors and contexts for those challenges. In terms of what we're actually looking for in a research hub, if I start us off on the top left, the challenge and impact focused quadrant, this is to generate excellent and novel research, but that can be translated into measurable development impacts, and that's very important. We expect a hub, because it's quite large, to deliver a broad range of scalable impacts, but also be able to have a sustainable program that will have a legacy beyond the initial investment. If we move over to the top right quadrant, to the focus on interdisciplinary research excellence, we're looking to use and develop excellent research capacity and capacity to think across, between and within sustainable development goals. We're looking to assemble and insights from the different research communities, as well as building on our previous investments. If I then focus your attention to the bottom right quadrant, the global partnerships quadrant, this is where it's really important that we have co-development with international partners. So that's at all stages, so kind of developing the initial concepts, the research questions, shared publications, shared impact. That's why we're really emphasising this focus on sustainable and substantial partnerships and collaborations. And this will then enable the full consideration of the relevant developing country context. The final quadrant, the bottom left one, looks at the organisation and leadership of these large awards. And we're looking for the leadership to have a shared set of values and goals with strong research and operational leadership, and appropriate and effective monitoring and evaluation of the research, but with the flexibility and ability to learn and to adapt. So now I'm just going to talk about eligibility and how people can get involved in these bids. So the director, the principal investigator or PI, needs to be employed by the lead organisation and will need to be employed for a term extending beyond the hub duration. As I said before, the lead organisations for these awards will need to be UK based, and so they'll need to be eligible for RCUK funding as lead. In terms of how we then get international partners involved, the primary route will be through a research partner organisation. So this is a new classification for us in its actual terms, and so it's quite important. I'll probably spend a little bit of time on this. So UK organisations can be research partners, and they will be the kind of usual eligible organisations. In terms of international research organisations, so these are universities, higher education, public labs, non-profit research intensive organisations. As part of getting involved in these bids, they'll need to demonstrate against a number of criteria, so in terms of ability to deliver the research, governance and control, and financial stability. So these are kind of in line with what you might call the usual due diligence checks that you would get as part of kind of a usual grant awards process. And what would happen is that these particular checks will be done later on in the process. So all we would need for the full stage applicants when they come in May is just a sort of a letter from the lead of the organisation, just saying, oh yes, we meet these various criteria, and then they would then be registered with the research councils. And the key thing is that the staff are eligible as co-investigators for these awards. So what would happen is, if you're, say, an overseas university, you say, oh yes, well, we comfortably meet that criteria, so you get put on as co-investigators, and then we would send more guidance on what that process would be. There is more detail in the call text, so I see that the Hub's outline call text has been uploaded to this webinar. Please do read through it. It just says a little bit more detail about what the organisations need to do in order to meet this criteria. And as I said, staff are eligible as co-investigators. So for my next slide, I'll just talk about some of the other ways that organisations can get involved. So project partners are organisations that don't meet the minimum criteria for research partner organisations. So for example, this could be perhaps a small NGO that may not have the required research capacity to be a research partner. Now that doesn't mean they can't be involved, and we would actually actively encourage their involvement. However, for this call, there are some restrictions on what we can fund for each of those smaller organisations. So we can fund 100% full-time equivalent of a staff member and some other costs as well. The details are in the call document, but you know, that's per organisation, so that they can be involved, and we can fund, although we would also expect ones with more money to put some of their own resources in. We can fund to a certain extent. We also have subcontracts, and that's quite important to mention because if it's a service, so if you've got, say, a local organisation that provides services, say it could be training services or other services, then that can be covered by the cost of the grant as well, and that's absolutely fine. There's no financial restriction on that, but of course it has to be fully justified as to what it is they're doing. I've just seen a question about identifying co-Is from international partners during the outline stage if they'll not be registered on the GES system until later. Okay, so I need to be very clear about this point because this has come up a few times. People can, prospective international co-investigators can register on at any time, and this is not the same as registering your organisation. So this is a bit of a technicality, but it is quite important. So what it means is that at outline or full stage, it's important that any international co-investigators themselves are registered on the GES system, but that does not mean that they would have to have gone through our process for eligibility. So these are two separate things. So what I would say is that if you're looking to be an international co-investigator on one of these awards, that make sure that you talk to the lead organisation and get yourself registered on GES as soon as possible. So that's separate from the eligibility checks that I was telling you about. So please do get yourselves registered on the system and get yourself on there as a co-investigator. This can take a few days and it can be a bit tricky. So yes, so please just speak to the research office or the research organisation and they'll hopefully guide you through it about how you register and how that gets confirmed. Yes, I've had a bit of question there for me to talk a little bit more about the GES system. I have some expertise on this, but it's not a system I use. All I know is that it does take a few days to get registered. So I'd say if you are likely to be a co-investigator or lined up to be a co-investigator on one of these awards, I'd say please do register as soon as possible. There is more information in the call text and a link to GES there, and there's also more in the FAQs. So please do spend a bit of time doing that, so that you are, on those outline and full stage bids as soon as possible, really. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual funding that is available to organisations, and this is very much country dependent. So UK research partners fit in with our normal policy. FEC stands for full economic costs, and what that means is that we have a certain calculation that we do where we fund some of the direct costs and some of the indirect or overhead costs, and we fund those at 80% to UK applicants. For DAC list countries, so that's the bottom row of this table, countries on the Development Assistance Committee list, we will fund up to 100% of the direct costs of doing the research, and we will also fund a contribution to the indirect or overhead costs up to 30% of the total of the direct costs. And I would again advise that you look at the call document because it shows in detail about what counts as a direct cost and what counts as an indirect cost. So please do have a look at that, and we would expect these to be reasonable as well. So every every proposal needs to demonstrate value for money. So it's important to make sure that these are all justified. In terms of countries that are not on the DAC list, or countries that are due to graduate from the DAC list, we will fund up to 50% of the eligible direct costs. So we'll fund up to 50% of those costs, and we would expect the other 50% to come from those countries or their countries' organisations. In terms of multi-campus universities, the costs will be awarded based on where the campus is legally registered. And for multinational organisations, the costs will be awarded dependent on the location of the headquarters of that organisation. So, for example, I think the World Health Organization's headquarters is in Switzerland or Paris, I can't remember. I think it's Switzerland. And because Switzerland is not on the DAC list, we would expect 50% contribution from the World Health Organization, and we would cover the other 50%. So I hope that sort of answers your question, Imelda. If not, please do ask again. In terms of the project partner organisations, so these are ones that don't meet that minimum required for research partners. So, for example, smaller local NGOs within countries, we will support up to one full-time equivalent per organisation across the award in terms of the staff costs and other reasonable non-staff costs. And there is a total of the hub that we can award towards these. But we will fund 100% of those costs. And subcontracts are awarded based on the location of the country managing the subcontract. So, for example, if it's more appropriate from a governance point of view for a subcontract to be managed through a developing country partner, then we will award the costs accordingly to that. So 100% of that. Gemma's just asked a question around any rules about where the match funds come from. So we don't have any particular rules about where the matched funds come from, as long as they are matched, so they do come. So it doesn't have to be from, for example, say if it was a university based in the US, it doesn't have to come from them. It could come from the US funder, or it could come from another source. The important thing is that those funds are found, yeah, for any more details, please do ask, various questions. But yeah, for us, the important thing is that there is an auditable record that those funds will be matched. Okay, so that's the funding available. I just have to be very clear about ineligible costs. So these are costs that the research councils will not cover, but that doesn't mean that these types of costs can't be sourced from other sources. So, for example, the research councils don't have a budget for any capital expenditure or infrastructure. So, for example, we can't fund a piece of equipment if it's a single piece of equipment that's over the value of £10,000. So we can't do that. That's just our rules. However, were you to need one of those bits of equipment and you found sources from somewhere else, that's absolutely fine. In terms of costs for government departments and businesses outside of subcontracts, we won't cover these. So we won't cover these as project partner costs or research partner costs. Obviously, if a business is providing a service, then that's okay, as long as it goes through the requisite procurement policies. And we don't cover fees or stipends for masters and PhD students. However, that doesn't mean that masters and PhD students could not be funded and work alongside a hub, and we will cover some costs. So, for example, research or travel costs outside the usual PhD award, we could cover. That's fine. So I've just had a few questions on this now. So pro bono contribution count as matched funds. I think from our point of view, what's important is that the total cost is correctly captured, and that it's clear that we're only providing 50% of that cost. So it's important that the cost is accurately and auditably provided for that, and then it's just clear how much it costs and that we are providing 50%. In terms of capital assets as matching funds for partners, Again, that's fine. Partners can put those matching funds in. I should be clear that partners don't have to put matching funds in unless they're from one of the developed country, a country that is not on the DAC list. But again, in terms of the 50% contribution, we'll only provide 50% towards the direct eligible costs of that. So the capital assets kind of sit outside that, but of course people can provide those matched assets, and they might be a particular strength to that hub bid depending on the context. Okay, so I've just had a question from Ali Ahmed about how does the allocated fund be distributed among the hub members. So the central management comes through the UK partner, but that is part of the collaboration agreement and the award. What's quite important about these awards is that the governance and management is made very clear, so it's clear how those costs get set up. So for example, as part of the bid, they will identify, say, for example, 50% of the cost to go to partner countries. So we would expect then that the 50% of the cost would go to those partner countries. But what they would then have to talk about is how the details of that would work in the governance, because they might want some kind of flexibility. So it's not necessarily all predestined for work packages. It might be that actually they've got some costs that are predestined for, say, the first 2 years, but they might want some flexibility for later on in the award, depending on where the research direction goes. So there'll be a kind of a central administration through the UK partner to be agreed upon by all partners as to how that will work. Okay, so my next slide. So that's really all I had to say on the hubs. In terms of how we encourage people to get involved in the Global Challenges Research Fund, we're keen for people to be part of projects either as UK or international co-investigators. They can also be researchers or as a different type of organisation, so research partner organisation, which I mentioned, project partner or subcontractor. We're also keen for people to get involved through peer review, and we are developing a GCRF college at the moment to try and get more peer reviewers from countries outside the UK. We'll also be looking for peer review panel members and attendees for meetings and workshops. Before I go on to my next slide, I see Eunice has just sent a question about regional partners located in a regional context in more than one country. Yes, absolutely. So you can have people in multiple countries. I think in terms of where we provide costs, it really does depend on where that person is primarily based. So they're based at an organisation, it's where that organisation is legally registered. But in terms of partners, absolutely, multiple regions is absolutely fine. Multiple countries within a region, again, is absolutely fine. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up now because I realise we're running a bit short of time. So we have a number of calls that are open. The web address there, the RCK/funding/GCRF, please do check that regularly. Here are some other calls that are open outside of the Hubs call. So hopefully these slides will be shared with you so you can see those. So here's ones that are closing very soon, and here are some other ones that are closing very soon. So that's all I really wanted to say on that, just quickly. That's my details there. Please do email our email address if you have any questions after the webinar. Otherwise, I'm not sure if I'm taking further questions now or we're going on to Kate next. I'll take the lead from Matt on that one, but that's my presentation finished.
Thank you very much, Rob. This is Matt again. Kate's going to go next, I believe, and then there'll be a further chance to ask questions at the end.
Thank you. Hello everybody, this is Kate Schreckenberg. I'm the Director of the ESPA programme. Thank you to Rob for a very good overview, very thorough overview of the GCRF and particularly the International Hubs call. I wanted to just add a very short presentation to share some of the lessons that we've learned in the ESPA programme on how to design and implement equitable partnerships, which are going to be central to this GCRF call. So for those of you on the webinar who don't know what ESPA is, ESPA stands for the Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation Research Programme. It was set up in 2009 with funding from the Department for International Development and two of the UK's research councils, the Economic and Social Research Council and the Natural Environment Research Council. And rather like the GCRF, it has a real focus on interdisciplinary research to try and understand the links between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation and to find ways of improving those links. Our approach is really very much in line with what the GCRF is now trying to do as well, and that the aim has always been to fund cutting-edge research, but research that absolutely achieves development impact. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the ESPA programme, we've been active for 8 years and we finish next year 120 or more research projects in 53 countries and over 900 researchers, with 50% from developing countries. So we've got quite a body of experience to draw on for sharing some lessons, which will hopefully be useful to people applying to the GCRF. In particular, our focus, central to our work has been to achieve development impact, and that is, as Rob has explained, to achieve development impact, you have to have good partnerships with people who are in country. You have to have a good theory of change, and you need to co-design the research from the beginning, identify questions that are actually relevant to the country you're going to work in, and then work out how, in a step-by-step process, you're going to pull together the required evidence and then actually turn it into impact on the ground. And ESPA projects have worked with a wide range of stakeholders, so all the way from local communities and NGOs to business partners to governments at local, national and level and international organisations. And in ESPA in the past we've had quite we started off with a distinction between two types of partners, which slightly mirror the GCRF distinction as well. So we had research partners and we had local impact partners whose role was seen very much to be involved in co-producing evidence and facilitating the uptake of research by decision makers in country. I think as we've gone along, we've realised that that distinction is not always very clear. You often have NGOs, for example, who you think might be more involved in impact, but they actually do really good research, and Southern research partners who are really good at achieving impact. So being flexible about this is important, but from the GCRF's point of view, you need to know, because the funding is different for the different organisations, you need to know which group you fit in, and I would suggest, if you're unsure, look at the documentation that's available, and there are lots of addresses of people to write to get further information. So for us, what is an equitable partnership? We found that in the projects we funded, there is a tendency for North-South partnerships to kind of stick to a rather standard division of labour, with Northern partners being more active in the project design, in relationships with funders, and if they're working in more than one country, doing the analysis of data across multiple countries. Also, they tend to take the lead in publishing findings in books and peer-reviewed journals, and sometimes in the interface with global level policy processes. At the same time, Southern partners tend to be more active, or very active, on the data collection side, the relationships with local NGOs and communities, and providing the interface with national level policy processes. So the question is that equitable? Well, yes, it can certainly be equitable. Equitable doesn't have to mean that everybody's doing the same thing, that they're all equal. Different organisations clearly have different strengths and comparative advantages, but the key thing that you have to really think about, and that you will have to prove in your GCRF applications, is that the roles and responsibilities amongst the hub partners have been properly discussed and agreed upon, rather than just being assigned by default. So just because you're in the South doesn't mean that you can't have, for example, an international policy impact role. So things to think about to make your partnership equitable. These three ideas come from the environmental justice literature. One is about recognition. Have you thought about all the potential stakeholders who might want to have a say in developing your hub proposal, both in the planning and in the implementation of it? Not just research partners, but local communities, businesses, local government, NGOs, who has a stake in this question this intractable challenge that you're trying to address. On the procedural side, are there clear procedures for all those different people who should have a say to actually have a say? Do they know how to get involved in the discussion? Are there clear lines of accountability so that when you take decisions, you know who's responsible for actually implementing that decision and who you can go to if decisions are not implemented? And are there transparent processes, for example, for things like dispute resolution? Over a 5-year project, there are likely to be misunderstandings, and you have to have a clear system for working out who can take decisions to help move things along when there are difficulties. To avoid some of those difficulties, there has to be clear agreement about distribution of costs and benefits. So there needs to be a really clear understanding at the beginning of who expects to get what kind of benefits out of the partnership and who is going to bear what kind of costs. Ultimately, I think our ESPA experience shows that 4 things are really important to get right when you're building these partnerships. One is, it's very good to have a joint history already of working together. A lot of our most successful partnerships within the ESPA program actually predate ESPA funding, so they're based on long-standing relationships of collaboration and trust. Having trust is so important if you are working in different countries with different ways of working and different means of communication. So knowing that, having known somebody and worked with somebody for a long time can be a really good way of making sure that that will also work into the future. Clarifying mutual expectations from the start and being very open and transparent about what it is you think you're going to get out of the hub and what you think you're going to contribute is also really important. And that should be not just at the beginning of the project and in the planning, but you also need a system with frequent meetings to update this and to be flexible and adaptable as you go on through the project. As Robert mentioned, the management of these hubs has to be flexible and adapt to changing situations. Then finances and logistics are often a cause of misunderstandings and of problems and delays in delivery of research results. And you need to plan for these from the beginning and also adapt as you go along. Southern partners in particular suffer from poor internet access, so backup communications need to be in place. You need to think about how things work. UK organisations are expected to invoice once they've already made the payments, and I know that's extremely difficult for some Southern partners to do, so that kind of discussion has to be held between the UK lead and the Southern partners to make sure the Southern partners understand that they will be invoicing in arrears. And lastly, transparency all the way through is again absolutely crucial. So sometimes it's very helpful to have an international advisory committee that again meets fairly regularly to sort out any issues that might arise and that is kind of above the day-to-day management of the hub. Having memorandums of understanding to sort out particular issues. Ones that come up frequently as being problematic are data sharing. Some people are collecting the data and then others are doing more of the analysis. What is the sort of intellectual property right over that data, and who is responsible and has the right to be involved in publications. So having an MOU around publications and a process for starting those and making sure everybody has a right to get involved or a chance to get involved, an opportunity, is really important. So don't want to say too much more. Basically, when you can get it right, equitable and effective partnerships are really, really rewarding, but it does take quite a time and lots of resources and effort to build those. So make sure that if you're putting in a hub proposal, you build in enough time and resources, enough face-to-face meetings, enough funding to support Southern partners in some of the operational and financial processes that are needed to make a hub of this size work, and take the time to get to know your partners socially as well as academically, and you know, have face-to-face meetings with them so that you build up the trust that can carry your hub through. Thank you. That's it from me.
Okay, yeah, so I've had a couple of questions. So first of all, I was going to comment, so yeah, thanks for that, Kate. That's really interesting, actually. Yeah, there was a couple of points there I wanted to talk about, especially with regard to the hub. So one of them is around the sort of International Advisory Committee. And when we do look that all our awards, especially at this scale, will have an independent advisory committee, and that they will have not just international academics, but also all stakeholder representation. And that's a kind of a thing that we've been developing. So that's likely to be a good thing to put into the bid, as it's something that we'll be looking for. I also wanted to briefly mention about some of the logistics as well. And I know there can be an issue with payment in arrears. As a funder, we can't issue payments in advance of need, but that's not to suggest that the UK lead organisation may not be able to do that. So, for example, if a university in the UK is willing to take the risk, they can send money in advance of need, and we don't have a problem with that so long as it's up to them, essentially. So that's something to be aware of, and if that's seen as potentially a barrier to getting involved, then talk to the UK university, because they may be able to do that. But as a funder, we can't do that. So building on a couple of the questions I've had. So there was one around clarification on in-kind contributions as matched funding. So for these awards, I mean, matched funding isn't required from developing country partners. However, it may enhance a bid, and in-kind contributions certainly do count a lot, and we do value those in addition to cash contributions. So, for example, if you have students at your organisation who may be working on this project alongside it, and they're funded through other sources, so by your organisation, then absolutely, please do count that as an in-kind contribution, as long as they are working on the research hub itself. So that's an example. Capital is also another example. Equipment, that kind of thing. So yes, yeah, please do include that, and then say that is forthcoming, because that can certainly enhance a bid if it's appropriate. The other question I had before the session was around giving an example of what we'd expect project partners to play, and hopefully I think I've covered this actually, and it was very interesting to hear Kate's definition around the local impact partners, and I'd say that does closely match what we're thinking of with project partners. And really, for us, the distinction between those two is that the research partners need to meet this criteria about having the research capacity, and then the project partners, which we can fund some of, yes, would play perhaps more of a role towards enhancing the impact of that. But as Kate said, in reality, what they do may be a bit more grey, so that you have local NGOs providing some of the research, and then perhaps the local developing country researchers providing some of the impact. So, but in terms of for us, we've got the distinction of kind of what they can apply for. But yeah, the roles are very, very similar to what Kate mentioned. Okay, so that's a good question we just had from Kate about what happens if project partners are in countries which graduate off the DAC list during the hub lifetime. So the costs that we will provide are in line with what we've said in the call document. So that will continue. So it is possible that some countries may graduate from the DAC list. We won't change our funding at this time, although for us, in terms of the overall project, if there are countries that are likely to graduate soon off the DAC list, it's important that the benefit is wider. But in terms of the funding we'll provide, there are no plans to change anything that we will actually provide to those countries based on the rules that we have. Another good question here about the allocation of funds between UK and non-UK institutions. So there aren't actually any limits to this. So what this means is that you can essentially, in theory, have all of the money going to the UK institution or all of the money going outside of the UK. In reality, what we've found is that this can vary anything between 25% going outside the UK to as much as 75% going outside the UK. So that's 25% in the UK and 75% in the developing country partners. So sort of, there's quite a wide range there. The average for our first call was 37%, so 37% of those funds were going outside of the UK. And it really does depend on what you're trying to achieve and where the most appropriate location for those resources is. So yeah, we don't have a limit. It's really what is most appropriate for the research hub. We've had a question from Ali Ahmed on the Ross Fund is focusing on health. Could you please explain in detail which health component is covered here? So I don't run the Ross Fund. I know it's one of the key health components run through the Department of Health. So you can find out more details. I don't know off the top of my head, I'm afraid. So, but I could certainly send more details through. But if you look it up online, you should be able to find some more details about exactly what they're covering. But I think, as far as I'm aware, the Ross Fund is generally towards global health. Okay, so there's a good question from John there about how you can find a UK institution to partner with. Yeah, so this is quite a tricky one, actually. So we have a list of the institutions and the grants they're working on through a portal called Gateway to Research. I'll be able to send the link, actually. So this is quite good because what it does is it shows you all the grants through GCRF and kind of what the people are actually working on. So bear with me 1 second. I will send that link through because what you can do then is you can see what people are working on, and as a result from that, you can have a look to see what the kind of people you might be able to partner with. So bear with me 1 second. I'll put that link on there. There are other organisations as well that can help with identifying partners, and I'll send another link through to that as well. So bear with me 1 second. Right, hopefully this will work. Okay, let me just put, so this is the Gateway to Research link. I'll just put that link in there. Other people that you can talk about as well, so is the UK Collaboration for Development Sciences, and they are very good at developing partnerships and linking people to UK partners. So let me just put a link for them as well. So try them as well, so they should be able to help with that a bit. Okay, right, we've had a few other questions. So AD said, can institutions in other OECD countries be involved as COI and or as project partners? Yes, so absolutely. So all the other OECD countries, they can be COIs. As long as they meet that research partner criteria, they absolutely can be COIs. The restriction comes from the amount of money that they can get. Project partners can't be COIs for this call. So that's just something to stress for this call. If they are to be a co-investigator, they need to be a research partner. That's not to say someone from a project partner organisation could not have quite a significant role within the project. They could be quite important and involved in the management even, but they're just not necessarily a co-investigator title on the grant, but they still could be involved. Just to clarify, the link I sent on the Gateway to Research, that includes the filter applied for the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is why it's long. But that should allow you to find some of the grants that we funded. So we have another question from Virgilio about funding for postdocs and senior research exchange visits eligible. Yes, these are. So funding from postdocs is an eligible cost, and that's for any country. And money for research exchange visits, again, is eligible as well, so that's fine. As long as everything is fully justified and you can demonstrate why it's value for money, that is eligible. Okay, I'm just going to answer George's question there. So the declaration of interest for the lead organisations that are telling, so the UK-based organisations telling us what they're doing. Now, for overseas partners, what that means is that you can join a project. You can join a project after that date, but it does need to be one of the ones that's submitted to us. So is via the UK partner. So the UK partner will tell us, oh, we're interested in doing this thing. in a particular area. If they then are continuing to build their partnerships, you could then get involved with them after that date. But what we're not having is we wouldn't expect you to submit an interest yourself from overseas. Of course, if you are UK based, George, then you would put a UK submission in, and then you could gather partners aside from that. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, this is Matt, Rob. I think you've answered all the questions that there were. Did you have any more to cover?
I think that was all from me. I think, yeah, unless anyone's got anything else, no, I think that was it.
Rob, I had also asked a question about what kinds of building activities GCRF was looking for, given that MSc and PhDs are not funded.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously we can't fund the actual fees or anything for those, but training is absolutely fine, an eligible cost. Any kind of training, obviously building capacity through research. Yeah, and that can, it could be research training, or it could be impact-based training, dealing with policymakers and things like that. Yeah, so those other types of things. But basically anything you can think of that isn't a student fee or a stipend.
Okay, thanks.
That's great then. Well, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much, Kate. ESPA would like to remind all the participants that we'll be sending around a written document that will cover all the questions that have been asked here. And we'll also be producing a video recording of the webinar, so people will be able to look at it subsequently. That will be available in the next couple of days. Will be emailed out to you, and also I think the PowerPoint presentations are going to be emailed out. Thank you very much for joining the webinar, and we'll call it a day.
Lovely, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.